Today on the Dig In podcast, I'm joined by Dr. Lynn Cohick, Distinguished Professor of New Testament and Director of Houston Theological Seminary at Houston Christian University. Dr. Cohick is President of the Institute for Biblical Research and author of the groundbreaking book, Women in the World of the Earliest Christians. What if everything you thought you knew about women in the early church was only half the story? What if women weren't just silent observers, but were actually patrons funding churches, deacons serving congregations, and leaders shaping the movement? Dr. Cohick has spent decades examining ancient documents, inscriptions, and archaeological evidence that reveal a stunning picture of women's active participation at every level of early Christianity. From Lydia's house church in Philippi to Phoebe's role as Paul's patron, from wealthy benefactors to enslaved believers, we're about to uncover the hidden stories of the women who helped build the church. Their world was complex, their influence was real, and their legacy has been waiting 2,000 years to be fully understood. Now it's time to dig in. Welcome, everybody, to the Dig In podcast. I am your host, Pastor Johnny Over, and today I have the privilege of speaking with Dr. Lynn Cohick. Dr. Cohick, thanks so much for joining us today. I appreciate your time. Looking forward to our conversation.
Oh, nice to meet you, Johnny, and thank you so much for inviting me on to Dig In. I love it.
My pleasure. My pleasure. All right, so we got a great topic today. Unfortunately, it's a controversial topic, but we're going to dig in a little bit over here. So I want to go back to the early church. And when most Christians today think about early church women, they think of them either as silent observers or exceptional anomalies like Priscilla, for example. What was the biggest surprise you discovered when you first began researching how ordinary women actually lived in the first century?
I think I was really surprised at how influential they were through the kind of informal patterns of their culture. And I don't know why I was surprised at that, because in our own culture today, so much is informal. Like, who has the most influence? George Clooney, Oprah Winfrey, or my local, Republican or Democrat in the state house? And yet neither of those celebrities hold a formal position, but they influence people. And I think that piece, recognizing that then as now people can influence, and there are ways that culture gives influence and importance to people outside of formal titles. So I think that's probably the biggest surprise for me, because like you, when I started in this, I assumed, women were in the house with no real agency and very limited opportunities. And that's not the whole story.
Yep. Not 100%. We just recorded with another guest who actually, she's an atheist who studied the same religious stuff about women. So I can't wait to parallel these conversations together to get the different perspectives. But one of the reasons why I had to have you on was when I was reading and listening to some of your stuff, you use the same exact example that I use with prescriptions and descriptions. Yes. And I'm like, me and Dr. Cohick here are kind of going down the same vein over here.
Nice.
So, and I use it a lot because I don't think people have this view that the Bible, God's up in heaven writing down on a pen and paper, throwing an airplane down, they catch it and go, thus saith the Lord, right? But a lot of times the Bible describes things and prescribes things. And so I want to turn that over to distinguishing the difference between prescriptions for women's behavior versus descriptions of their actual lives. So can you help us understand how ancient philosophers might have skewed our understanding of women's real experiences?
Sure.
Possibly?
Yeah. Well, in any kind of treatise where you're trying to do like the optimum, or you're trying to describe things in the abstract, you tend to generalize to the point that you're almost making like a prescription. This is the ideal, right? And Aristotle is probably the most well-known for doing that. He lived about 400 years or so before the period of the New Testament, but his ideas were really influential. So Aristotelian thought and Platonic thought had kind of morphed a little bit into Stoic thought. So Stoicism would have been most prevalent, but it all, for the average person, the ideas of Aristotle, especially how he saw the world as kind of a binary. You had male, and the opposite of male is female. And it wasn't like they're different. It's that they're different in a hierarchical way, or they're opposites. So the opposite of male is female. And with that kind of substructure, then people started imagining, well, then how would these men and women live out their lives, in the world? And you start thinking, well, women are not quite children, grown-up women are not quite children, but they don't really have the mental, rational capacity that a male does. And so we're not going to let them have full rights in the courts, for example. So in our day, in the time that we're talking about, first century, women could make petitions in the courts, but they needed to have a male guardian sign any of the official documents. So, and it went back to this idea that they're grown-ups, but they don't have full rational capacity like the male. So so you can see how like the descriptive, what is a woman, goes back to the prescriptive, Aristotle's sort of abstraction of what male and female means.
Interesting. Very interesting. It's just wild to think about it. It really is hard to put yourself in that place. I guess let's go to the family life now. I guess we could start there too. How did the Greco-Roman household structure actually work, and where did Christian women find unexpected power within these domestic spaces?
Sure. Well, again, Aristotle's that's where you have to start. He imagined the family as larger than what we think of today. So you had husband and wife, you had father and child, but then you also had slave and owner. And those three pairs were what made up the family as Aristotle saw it, in the abstract, in the prescriptive. In real life, there were a lot of blended families. The life expectancy was short. Most everyone married. And then a lot of people married a second or third time due to a spouse's death. There was no reliable birth control, so most women got pregnant, and as many women died in childbirth and complications of that as men died in the battlefield. So it was an incredibly dangerous endeavor, but children were really valued. Maybe 50% of children lived beyond the age of 5. It was a really brutal time in terms of life expectancy. So I say all that because I think that the family wanted children that lived to adulthood and were able then to carry on the family line. So pregnancy and childbirth were both very dangerous, but also really desired for both families. So that's one aspect. The other thing, though, that's kind of interesting in all of this is when the woman married, she never formally left. Well, she maintained ties with her father's family. So it's a type of marriage, unlike, let's say, in Victorian England, where when the woman married, all of her assets, all of her finances went to the husband's family. You think of, like, I was a big fan of Downton Abbey, and the Abbey, the manor house is saved because he marries a rich American heiress, and gets all her money. Well, in the ancient world, the woman brought her dowry into the marriage, but she retained, she didn't retain control of it while she was married. But if she was divorced or he died, she received it back. If he made money on the dowry, he could keep that But if he lost money on the dowry, he owed it to her.
Wow.
If he divorced her. So she kept, but she also could have her own bank account, if you will, or her own property separate from her husband that he had no oversight. So
Wow.
it's kind of like we think that women were completely controlled by their husbands. And from our vantage point today, that certainly can ring true in certain ways. But she also had financial assets, or she could, depending on how much money she had. She could receive gifts from her mother or father. She could inherit if she was a Gentile, Roman. She could inherit. If she was Jewish, they called it something slightly different, deed of gift. But parents could gift their daughters date groves, for example, or half of a courtyard in a building, in a big home. So she could have some of her own her own property, her own, and thus she could be a shopkeeper, a businesswoman, whether she was Jewish or Gentile. So she had that opportunity, but in order to affect meaningful agency in the courts, she needed to have a male sign for her. Could be her husband, could be her father, brother, uncle, or friend. So anyway, it as you just dig a little bit as you dig in below the surface, you realize there's a lot more agency that women had when you just look at how the day-to-day operated, and not look simply at like the treatises that suggest an ideal world. Yeah. Or an ideal world for the men. I don't know if the women would say it was ideal.
The first thing that as you're talking, though, is what a disadvantage a woman coming from a poor family would have if they had no it's almost like there's if at least if the woman was wealthy, she had something like that, almost not to hold over the head, but she had something that was her own. If it was poor, it's almost between that and then the male dominant culture, I guess, due to the physicality, war, culture. Because you go back to the beginning, right? If we talk about the beginning of at least the biblical narrative, where you got Adam and Eve, and you have this tag team, for lack of a better term, right? This team that's supposed to be working and building together, their oneness, their unity displays this beautiful, complete picture of God together. And somewhere along, I feel like every bad thing, Dr. Cohick, always goes, and somewhere along the line, we've got
yes.
right? It just turns into this massive control, power, dominant, like you should be lucky that you can keep the land because I could, like, that type of attitude towards it. So it seems like that if you were a woman and you came from a poor family, you were at an extreme disadvantage.
Yeah, especially if you were widowed or widowed young, and didn't have your parents still surviving. Then you'd hope on an uncle or maybe a brother that was nearby. That's why I think when we look at, now this is much earlier, but the story of Ruth, and Naomi realizes she's quite vulnerable. There is a plan that the culture has, a kinsman redeemer, but you're really at the mercy of whether given individual will be responsible. In Ruth's case, Boaz certainly was. But yeah, there's definitely a vulnerability, and that speaks to, I think, another really important aspect of family life, which is the sense of loyalty that people felt for their family, and then also maybe for their neighborhood or their community. You really needed to rely on each other because you were just in general so vulnerable, sure. Even to like the famines or a natural disaster. So anyway, the idea of the individual that we just assume today would not have just not have been a part of things. People took their identity from their family for the most part. Men also, we see this in like the tombstones, could also take their identity in part from their job. If you were a soldier or something like that, you would note that on your tombstone. Women tended to either something religious, if they were, as a Gentile, a priestess or something like that, but also who they were married to, who their father was, if they had an important son. It's not that men didn't, but I'm just saying that on average, women identified with their family much more. And that becomes important as we read the biblical text as well. Women tend to be identified by their relatives more so than men. And we just need to be alert to that as then we read how women are identified in the New Testament.
Yeah, you've uncovered some fascinating evidence about women as patrons and benefactors. Can you walk us through how someone like maybe Phoebe could be Paul's patron and what that actually meant in terms of financial power and influence? Because it seems like that would be a influential position.
Absolutely.
And
yes.
dangerous at the same
time. Yes, absolutely. So patronage is one of those institutions that's very important in the culture, but it's not part of the legal framework. One of the important philosophers in the first century, Seneca, talks about how he doesn't want this institution to have to be in the legal realm. He likes it in the cultural realm because it sort of keeps people, now these are my words, but it keeps people honest, because patronage is all about reciprocity. If you have resources, you should use them for the benefit of either a particular individual or a community. And if you receive a gift as an individual, you need to honor your patron. So you have this reciprocity or relationship that builds. And that's really important in this culture. So what that means, let's say we go to your example of Phoebe, who is mentioned by Paul in Romans 16, 1 and 2. And she is the deacon of Cenchrea, which is the eastern port of Corinth. And we know Paul spent 18 months there in Corinth, so he probably got to know her well. And she is a benefactor of Paul. Sometimes English translations use the word helper. She's a helper of mine. That's a really weak translation of what is a proper, descriptor of a relationship at this time. So a benefactor, they might have offered hospitality, let Paul stay in the home. Lydia, and we can turn to her in a minute, Acts 16 would be an example of that. They may have financially sponsored Paul, but benefactors could also make introductions. And Phoebe might have some business in Rome. She's the one that seems to have taken the letter that Paul wrote to the Romans and takes that to Rome. So she might have some connections that way, or just be well known in Corinth. And so kind of help Paul, if things get a little messy, as sometimes when he's preaching that happens. Right. Maybe she can, hey, I'm a friend of Phoebe. Okay. All right. I'll, back away. So the benefactors can do a lot of different things. And it's a really important part of the culture. People relied on each other in that way. This is, getting back to your opening question, this was one of the things that really stuck out to me when I wrote my Women in the World of the Earliest Christians years ago. I'm actually working on a second edition, so
nice.
Excited about
Very
that.
Cool.
Yeah, but the just this idea that through the mechanisms of benefaction, women had real influence and voice and agency in their community without any blowback or accusations of stepping out of line or anything like that, because it was a construct, an informal institution that benefited others. And so women could do that. So a Lydia, right? She offers safety and a home and food for Paul and Silas, Timothy, and Luke there in Acts chapter 16 there in Philippi. And, Paul gets arrested, beaten, thrown in prison, he and Silas, then released when it's revealed that he's a Roman citizen. Before he leaves the city, he stops by Lydia's house. And I think he does that because he knows that she could be vulnerable to a mob coming against her because she initially opened her house to him. And so she helped him big time. Now he, with his Roman citizenship, can help her by stopping at her house, by letting everybody know, this is my friend. And so you can see the reciprocity, you can see the care that people rely on, right? So Lydia would be, she's not identified specifically with the word benefactor the way Phoebe is, but she acts that way to Paul.
Interesting.
And Jesus had a benefactor by the name of Mary Magdalene. So in Luke chapter 8, verses 1 through 3, Mary Magdalene and other women who are listed there, they helped Jesus out of their own funds. And so, you know, it's ubiquitous practice in the ancient world, and we tend not to see it today.
Right. It's going to this home church model. I was just curious, you know, off of because listen, I'm from New York. We know a lot about benefactors over here in the city.
Yes, that's true. Yeah, no, it doesn't always get good press either.
No, not at all. Not at all. A little too close to home.
Yeah.
But we have this today. You know, we meet in these beautiful buildings and these temples, or you know, these churches, and I think we can very easily get caught up in the our own bubble is the way it's always been. Nothing's ever changed. This is the way Christianity started. Everybody came with their Bibles that didn't exist in the first century and all that stuff, right?
Nowadays they're coming with their phones, right?
No, that's right. Yep, the phones are you having to read to me as I'm driving, things like that.
Yeah.
And I think the house church model, obviously central to Christianity, played such an important role in regards to not just how they experienced fellowship and communion, but also how women interacted in these homes, right? And so how did hosting these gatherings in their homes give women authority and maybe some leadership opportunities that we might not expect or often overlook?
Yeah. So let's go back to Philippi with Lydia.
Okay.
As you read her story, when she receives the gospel message, she and her household are baptized. So she is running the house. She is, we would say maybe in English, the head of the house. The way Greek doesn't use the word head the way that we use it today, or that Latin or that Hebrew does, but meaning the person that was the decision maker in the house. It was Lydia, and she and her household were baptized. A little later on in that same story, the jailer and his household are baptized. What you see in this is this notion of community that I mentioned earlier, where people saw those who were responsible for the household, they were trusted to make decisions that would benefit the whole household. So again, unlike today where we want everyone to make their own choice, and we tend to think that when you become an adult, one of the ways you show that you're an adult is you make individual decisions, often the opposite of your parents, just to show that you're an individual. But in the ancient world, that wasn't the assumption. And, you know, I'll tell you a little story. We lived in Kenya for a couple of years in the 90s. Wow. And there was, I got to know a younger Kenyan by the name of Paul real well. And at one point, both his parents were deceased when I met him. And so he was raised by his grandparents. And at one point, his grandfather got real sick and was in the hospital. And I said to Paul, "Oh, what's wrong?" And he said, "Well, I don't know. My uncle, his grandfather's brother, has come into town. And when he thinks that it's appropriate for me to know, he will tell me." I know. And I was just like, wow, okay, that would not fly in America. Because, I mean, Paul at this point was in his early 20s. But I saw in that just the assumption that my elders are looking out for me. They're wise. They know what they're doing. And so I'll wait till they make the decision. And that I thought, oh, wow, I have a window into the first century world with that story.
Right.
So when Lydia makes the decision to follow Christ, her household thinks, oh, well, this must be the way to go. And it's not that they don't also personally commit, but they do so sort of because they trust her, you know? Yeah. So anyway, she would have then most likely had believers that continued to meet in her house since she had welcomed them. Same with Priscilla and Aquila. Paul talks about them. He met them in Corinth, Acts 18, and they presumably have a house church that's meeting there in Corinth, but then also in Ephesus. And then they move back to Rome. So they end up both traveling, but wherever they are, it seems like they bring a group to be in their home, Nympha, and the church that meets in her home. There's just not a sense of restriction for women leading the body. And I think one of the points to note in all of this, and this comes especially, I would say, with a discussion about Andronicus and Junia, which are another couple that is mentioned in Romans 16, along with Priscilla and Aquila. They're in jail, and they were in Christ before Paul met them. They're also Jews like Paul. And they're promoting the gospel to the point that they're imprisoned, just like Paul is imprisoned because of his message. And I like to point to that just to say that leadership in Paul's mindset, in Jesus's mindset, is that you take up your cross and you follow after me and you serve others. It's not about getting the C-suite or the reserved parking spot. Right. And I think that's really important when people are talking about, did women lead? It sometimes feels to me like they're imagining leadership in glamorous ways, and that's not how the biblical text is promoting it. It's about service. Yeah, women were leading, but leading, from a prison cell or, yeah, so.
Right. Yeah, it all goes back to that again, that partnership that through the male dominated. We had a guest on where she attributed a lot of maybe the benefits that women have attributed to the gospel were because there was male dominant writers of the gospels and a lot of the religious texts. And so she was leaning more towards, well, of course, men are going to honor the men and not the women in those types of writings. But again, I just think it more goes back to the culture of what I find it that we make the biggest mistakes and bring the most confusion when we take our 2025 mindset and then try to implant that onto there. Meanwhile, my personal belief is if we just went back into the first century, we wouldn't have any idea what half of the things that they're talking about. Like, wait, explain this to me again, right? The words that they're different. The way of life was just so different. I think on trying to do our best to understand context, intent, and culture, I think could illuminate the scripture in ways that we maybe overlooked in the
right.
past before,
Yes. I teach in a Doctor of Ministry program at Houston Christian University. And one of the students finishing her doctorate, her dissertation, looked at the contributions of women writers, broadly speaking, at this time. One of the things that she looked at was, or one of the things she discovered, I guess, in really vivid ways, was how many women's either direct knowledge or direct words were part of Luke's gospel, to say nothing of Acts. So, for example, when Elizabeth feels the quickening of John the Baptist in her womb, there is no way that anyone would know that other than Elizabeth saying it. Do you know what I'm saying? And there's just those kinds of, or when the woman is healed, when she touches Jesus's fringe, and the she feels the power. There's no way anybody knew that other than if she told them. And so there's women's voices. We just don't have the radio tuned to that frequency to recognize that,
True.
and but it's there. And we should attune our radio to that frequency. I think it's important because because when women and men recognize, as you were saying, that this is a job we do together to help faithfully represent together Christ to the world, it strengthens us and encourages us. Yeah.
Yeah. You've done an amazing job of explaining how these women interacted in these different roles. I would like to go a little bit deeper and ask you to talk about a little bit about the archaeological evidence, like the tombstones and the inscriptions. What do they reveal about their roles? The inscriptions over some archaeological digs that name some of the women as head of household or things like that. Like maybe like breaking that down a little bit, or any findings that would maybe affirm some of their roles in the scripture.
Sure. Yes, we have, these were known. So for example, I'll talk about the synagogue inscriptions that were found in Asia Minor, maybe over 100 years ago, but only recently, well, in the 80s and beyond, were re-examined. There's a word, leader of the synagogue, arche-synagogos. You find that also in the biblical text. But on these inscriptions, that was connected with women. And when they were first discovered, the archaeologist assumed that it was an honorary title, that it couldn't actually be functional. And then more women scholars began looking at this and saying, why are we assuming that this is honorary and not functional? What's going on? And it's that kind of re-examination of the evidence where we find women are having this kind of benefactors for sure. Eumakia, this would people who, if they've been to Pompeii, would have seen her statue. She was a patron of the Fullers Guild, and that was a very important guild, sort of like dry cleaners and clothes makers all combined. And she helped sponsor that trade guild. And so they would honor her, and they honor her with this statue, which was very important. Part of the sort of social currency of the day was to get this kind of public honor. So we see, and I'm not even talking about the imperial cult, which was incredibly important at this time. And Augustus's wife, Livia, she was the main priestess for his cult when Caesar Augustus died. She continued with honoring him. And she herself, when she died, was then deified. So that by the time, again, going back to Philippi, when Paul was in Philippi, there would already have been near the city a temple or a shrine for Livia. We know that because there's a inscription that talks about someone who was a priestess in that. So there's enough evidence that women held important roles, even in the religious communities, Jew and pagan at this time, across, and also patrons. What survives is in stone. We don't know there probably were a lot more activity of women that we just don't know about because it's 2,000 years and destroyed it.
We just don't have it. Yeah. So, all right. You mentioned Mary Magdalene, benefactor before of Jesus. I believe you argue she was most likely a businesswoman or trader rather than a prostitute.
Yes.
So how did this misidentification happen, and what does her actual story tell us?
Yes. Well, so the story goes completely sideways, and I think it's like 591, something like that. It's late 6th century. And she is identified by Pope as a compilation of a couple of different Bible stories. Luke 7, the sinful woman who anoints Jesus's feet at the house of Simon the Pharisee. The named Mary Magdalene that's mentioned in Luke 8. The woman with the alabaster jar that's not named in Mark and Matthew, who anoints Jesus at the end of his life, and who is named in John 12 as Mary of Bethany. And so all of those kind of get pulled together because of the anointing theme. They get pulled together, as I say, formally by the 6th century, although Tertullian in the 2nd century was already kind of combining this Mary Magdalene, from whom 7 demons were cast, with the sinful woman, the chapter before in Luke. So that's what happens is very early on, these 7 demons are allegorized as the 7 deadly sins. And then, because she's female, they've got to all be sexual. So, according to the monks. And so that's how it all kind of gets sideways. But if we just look at the biblical evidence, Mary Magdalene is mentioned in Luke 8 as a benefactor of Jesus, as someone who was healed, right? So that's all we know, is that she was healed. And I think maybe she was healed of a crippling disease, similar to later in the Gospel of Luke. He talks about this crippled woman, this daughter of Abraham, who had a spirit that crippled her, right? At times, illnesses, what we would call illnesses, were described as also having like kind of a demonic dimension to them. And so she had the 7 demons cast out, and it may have been just simply an exorcism, but it may also be a way of describing a serious illness that she was healed from. So she followed Jesus. And we know that women were shopkeepers and they could run family businesses. We have from the early 2nd century an archive from a woman, Babitha, that talks about some of the property that she owned. She had date groves. Talks about she was married once and had a son from that relationship, and then her husband died. She remarried, but she kept trying to get her son, whose name was Jesus, kept trying to get more support from his guardians. Legally, he was considered an orphan, even though she, as his mother, was alive. So she kept going to court, and she was saying, "Look, I can contribute my own money to his allowance, his monthly allowance, but I'd like, in other words, so that he could live a higher status," and his guardians wouldn't do it. So we have record of her engaging that. And in all of those court records, there's a guardian or her own friend male friend who is signing that. So she clearly has money. She has resources. We know that from the date groves. So Mary Magdalene also could have, I don't know what business she would have been in, but women are just there doing their work, and she might be a widow,
right,
and continuing her family's job. She has enough work that she's able to contribute and be known for contributing to Jesus's ministry. She follows him in Galilee. Mark chapter 15, I think it's verse 40 and 41, talk about these women who followed Jesus in Galilee. But she's probably best known for seeing Jesus in the garden when he is raised. And that's in John 20. And Chrysostom, I think it's Chrysostom, the church father a couple of 100 years later, describes her as, or maybe it's even later than that. But anyway, church figure describes her as an apostle to the apostles.
That's right.
And that is apostle, someone who is sent to the apostles. There's so much artwork in the medieval and Reformation, the Renaissance period, that depicts this scene. Noli me tangere, the do not grasp, do not cling to me, was often depicted. It's a moment, that's very precious to the church, and that's Mary Magdalene. So there's extra biblical tradition about Mary Magdalene that is positive. One in particular I find kind of interesting is that she preached to Tiberius about the resurrection.
Okay.
She was holding an egg, and he said, "I'm not going to believe in the resurrection unless that egg turns red." So of course the egg turned red. I don't know that he believed in the resurrection, but anyway, and she's also, there's the tradition. If you go to Ephesus, the tradition is that she joined Mary, the mother of Jesus, and John there to end her days, helped John write the gospel.
Wow.
So yeah, so she's beloved in the church on up through, and as I say, there's some extra biblical stories of her. All are real good.
Right.
So
all positive light.
Yeah.
All showing a positive. Awesome.
Yeah.
I have a few more questions here, if you don't mind. I
Yeah.
would like to get to.
Yes.
One of them, I have to get to this question. Paul's writings about women specifically, debated for centuries here. Based on your research into what we've been talking about, their social context, how should we understand passages like "women be silent" when we know women, specifically like Junia, were recognized as apostles? And even if you want to touch on Junia a little bit, because I know there's also, Junia is a man, the name was changed, but I what you brought up is one of my points. Well, then what type of relationship did she have with Andronicus, if it's a woman? So things like that. But if you could touch on that, that would be fantastic.
Sure. Well, I think one of the two things to keep in mind. First is I like to start with, how did Paul actually, when he talks about his relationships with his coworkers, how does he describe that? So he talks about Euodia and Syntyche as his coworkers, whose names are written in the book of life. This is in Philippians 4. He speaks only with praise for Prisca and Aquila. And we know from Acts chapter 18, I think it's verse 26, that Priscilla and Aquila, they taught Apollos. So the finer or the deeper things about Scripture. He was a believer, but they spoke privately with him about some deeper truths. So they educated him. He talks with Phoebe. He has no problem that Phoebe is a deacon, and that it's the word deacon. It's not deaconess. It's the word deacon, which suggests an office, because it's the deacon in the church of Cenchrea. So it's a church that has functionally, and whatever that function is, it's hard to know because they're just getting started. But she's identified that way. And so I look at the practice, and I assume that Paul's consistent then in he won't request something that would be opposite of what he's comfortable doing. So in Corinth, then, when we shift and we look at what's going on in Corinth, remember Priscilla and Aquila were working there for 18 months alongside Paul, and presumably Priscilla and Aquila are teaching. So Priscilla, that church is used to a woman's voice. What they aren't, what seems to be happening in the passage that you talked about, that women should be silent, this is in chapter 14, is there's a lot of chaos that is going on in that church service, or that church meeting. You can see that in chapter 14. And Paul, just before this passage, talks about how the person speaking has control of the prophecy that they're saying. So you can't just speak out, interrupt. If you're going to speak in tongues, there needs to be an interpreter. And so Paul then says women should be silent and ask their husband at home. I think, okay, well, ask your husband at home. What's the percentage of married women in the church versus widows? I mean, is it 50-50? And then, of course, we have slave women who wouldn't technically be married and wouldn't have technically a husband. So when I think about that, I think, oh, all right. So is there kind of some chaos going on that also is represented where a wife is interrupting her husband? In which case, ask at home. Don't be doing it in front of everyone. That, as if a man today constantly interrupts his wife when a bunch of friends are out for dinner, you start to feel uncomfortable.
Right.
Or a woman constantly interrupts her husband, again, in public. Everybody feels just like, feel sorry for the spouse,
Yeah.
And so that's how I would construct that setting,
Okay.
right? It keeps Paul consistent all the way around, and is also attuned to what the church was actually like. 'Cause not every woman had a husband at home that they're going to, they would ask.
Right.
So I would say that is one thing. Again, if we go to 1 Timothy 2, that I'm not permitting a woman to teach or to have authority over man. She must be quiet. Doesn't mean never talking or never speaking. I think, okay, well, that's Ephesus. We know Priscilla and Aquila were teaching in Ephesus. Timothy knows them. He would know the people, a lot of Paul's co-workers. So maybe he knows Euodia and Syntyche there up in Philippi. Maybe he knows Junia and Andronicus. He's been with Paul for a while now. The problem in Ephesus that Timothy is dealing with is false teachings that are permeating everything. It's not just that there are a few women who are teaching heresies. From the very beginning of the letter, Paul talks about you've got to shut down these teachers these myths and endless genealogies, and it goes for 6 chapters, different problems that they're having. So I look at, and I could spend a long time going through what's going on in 1 Tim 2, but suffice it to say that I think the key in that passage is at the beginning of that section, verse 11, Paul commands Timothy that women should learn. A woman must learn. That's the imperative. And everything else that follows is Paul trying to encourage Timothy to create an environment where these women, Gentile women who don't know the gospel story in the way that Prisca and Aquila knew it, those Jews, or Andronicus and Junia, Jews. The Jews had such an advantage because they knew God's word. The Gentiles are just catching up, and learning the word. So the Timothy can hang out, at Starbucks and teach the guys, but he can't do that with women. So he's got to come up with a strategy, and Paul wants him to come up with a strategy. And of course, this letter is to Timothy, but it's going to be read to the whole church. So I think Paul, in saying this to Timothy, is like also saying to everybody else in the community, you got to give this guy space. Yes, he's a young pastor, right, but let him do his job. Like, let him live into what I've called him to do. So anyway, that's where I would go with them. And I think with Andronicus and Junia, early, the first several centuries, the church fathers that comment on that, they know that the name Junia is a female name. I think we have like 250 inscriptions in Rome alone with that female name.
Wow.
Junius with an S on the end is actually a made-up name. And it happened in the 13th century. The guys, the monk that did this was using the Latin text, and there's different endings on Latin names, and it gets really complicated. But the bottom line is he wanted to change the name to a masculine. And that the Junia stayed for a long time, up into very recently. And then people realized, it's just not accurate. It's not the most reliable texts have it as a woman. So then what was questioned was whether or not she and Andronicus, presumably her husband, I don't know, maybe a brother, but presumably a husband, that they were known by this group called the apostles rather than being apostles themselves. and it gets to the dative, this wee little preposition, and whether it's how to understand the dative. But in a natural sort of typical way to understand it would be that they are well known among the apostles. They are part of the group of the apostles. And I mean, Barnabas is called an apostle also. Right. It doesn't mean one of the 12, obviously, because Paul is also an apostle.
Sure.
Epaphroditus, who is mentioned in Philippians, was sent by his church, the Philippi church, to help Paul while he's in prison. We tend not to think that Epaphroditus was like apostle with a capital A for, the whole of the church, maybe just a localized sent by that church. But the way that, and the context makes that pretty clear, whereas Barnabas seemed to have more of a, if we could say, an international reputation, it feels to me like Romans 16 with Andronicus and Junia has that same flavor.
Yeah.
But so that's kind of the debate that's happening. But I think if it was, Bob and Ray among the apostles, everybody would be like, oh yeah, it's like they're part of the group of the apostles. It's just that it's a woman's name, so it gives pause.
Sure. Dr. Cohick, this has been fantastic. I've thoroughly enjoyed this, and I've learned a ton from you. So I can't thank you enough for your time. Is there any way for people to get a hold of you, read up on some of your stuff? I know I got some links of yours that I'm going to put into the description of the YouTube and the podcast descriptions, but any way for people to connect? Yeah,
I think so. So I have the Center for Women in Leadership organization, and they can reach that leadershipwithoutapology.org. So leadershipwithoutapology.org, all one word. And that would be, then they could certainly connect with me that way. And I mentioned I am at Houston Christian University, so they can connect with me that way too. So, but thank you so much, Johnny, for this conversation. It's so fun. I love to geek out on this stuff.
No, it's been great. I love myself just feasting off of this. It's just great. It's such good information and much needed, honestly, conversation. I love having these types of conversations with people, and I will put all of your stuff for people to connect with you.
Right.
Like I said, awesome. The descriptions of the YouTube and and in our email blast that go out. But again, Dr. Cohick, thank you so much. And there's so much more that I had here, but we are constrained by time, but I hope to have you on again in the future for sure.
That'd be awesome. Thanks so much, Johnny.
Thanks for tuning in to the Dig In podcast with me, Johnny Ova. If you enjoyed today's episode, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Follow us on YouTube, and don't forget to rate us 5 stars on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen. You can also check out more at soh.church. See you next time as we keep digging in.